Welcome to another edition of the Sports Lunatics. Who are the Sports Lunatics? Well, we're just two regular guys who love sports history. Hi, I'm Shawn, Lavigne in Halifax, Nova Scotia,
And I'm Howie Mooney in Barrie, Ontario.
and you are watching or listening to the Sports Lunatics on your favorite platform or on our YouTube channel. And Howie, I want to get right into it. It's been a few weeks since we've last done a show, but the actual day that we're taping today marks a very sad and tragic anniversary in the National Hockey League. And that was the passing of Tim Horton. And for those who know of Tim Hortons, the donut shop, of course, that was Tim Horton, the hockey player's entrepreneurial masterpiece. But I also want to focus on the hockey player because I think, like we did, and we got great response on our Frank Mahovlich video and podcast that we talked about Frank Mahovlich. He's a forgotten star in the National Hockey League, and I think is overshadowed because of the entrepreneurial success he had and just the legendary brand that it is in Canada. But I want to go back 50 years because I was very young and I do not remember the day where the tragic news, was beamed across the country that Tim Hortons died in an automobile accident. But I know that was your wheelhouse as a teenager. So just go back 50 years to today and your feelings.
I can't remember why, but I was across the street at my friend John Hughes's house. And when we heard the news, I mean, everything was so slow back then, eh? There was no internet, there was no anything like that. It all had to go over wires, and it got over the news, and I think we were in his house, and it came across in the morning, about like 10, 11 o'clock in the morning or something like that, that Tim Horton had played in a game with the Sabres in Toronto the night before and was driving back on the QEW to Buffalo, and his Pantera, I think it was a Pantera, and it was a really fast car anyway, and he lost control of it and died in an accident on the QEW. And when news came across, John and I looked at each other just like stunned silence, because Tim Horton, one of the great Leaf defensemen of all time. I can't imagine a pairing with him and Borje Salming on it or something like that. It would just be, just incredible. Those two guys, like they're both strong like oxes, and you can't move them, and they can move you, but you can't move them. Just they could pick you up and throw you up into the fifth row if they wanted to. Two guys like that, Tim Horton, just an amazing defenseman, and of course he was in his 30s by this point, nearing probably what was like the later points of his career with the Sabres. But just a great hockey player, a great defenseman, and just the shock. And I'm sure it wasn't just for us, because looking at social media today, all of the people who remember Tim Horton, all of the Toronto media people who remember Tim Horton, and they're posting about it. It just bringing back all these vivid memories 50 years later, and 50 years just feels like it was the other day.
Yeah, it is pretty shocking actually that it has been 50 years and actually he was 44. And
Wow.
I heard his story Gord Stellick told today on NHL radio with Scott Laughlin, two good friends of mine, and it was great stories because Gord was, I believe, an usher or he was working at Maple Leaf Gardens at the time, and obviously a huge Leaf fan growing up, and that car, the reason why he had that car is that was one of the deals with him and Punch Imlach, who was in Buffalo at the time. And Punch essentially got him out of retirement to say, hey, come and play in Buffalo for a couple of seasons. And the car was like, I don't know if it was a gift or if it was part of the contract, but that's how he ended up with that car. Ironically, that killed him. But all the stories I had ever heard about Tim Horton was exactly what you just said. It was just strong as an ox, and we always see these classic pictures of Bobby Hull and Gordie Howe, and guys were just built. I don't know how you want to call it back then. There wasn't really weight training per se like it is today, but they were just strong men. And you look at pictures of Tim Horton. I wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley, I'll tell you that, because he just had that look. And that's what Gord said today about, if you did an all-time Leafs team, the first pairing would be Tim Horton and Boreas Salming in his.
Just imagine, eh? Just
Yeah,
imagine. Oh,
and
uh,
and Tim Horton was part of 4 Stanley Cup winners, the last Leafs dynasty. He and Alan Stanley were the pair that really helped the Leafs win 4 Stanley Cups.
I remember Marcel Pronovo, a guy who played 1,000 games when 1,000 games in the NHL meant something. A six-team NHL, there's only 120 jobs basically. And he was saying you had to be tough. You had to be tough at that time to play in the NHL and to last in the NHL. Because if you weren't tough, you were going to get sent down, and you didn't want to get sent down to the minors because that's where the real tough guys were, and you didn't want to have to mess with them. You wanted to stay in the NHL and play there. Uh, the other thing too, story about Tim Horton when he started his very first donut shop, and it was in Hamilton, and he kind of cajoled five guys, five teammates to go and sign autographs, and he promised them each $25. And when it was all done, he was paying the guys their $25, and Johnny Bower was the last guy, and he didn't have $25 to give him. He says, "I promise I'll pay you tomorrow when we have the morning skate." Well, Johnny Bower gets to his locker the next morning, and his locker is full of $25 worth of donuts. And and he says, "Tim, get these out of here. Punch is going to think I'm a fat pig."
That story lives on forever. I've heard that story many years ago, and could you imagine getting? Because back then that would be a lot of donuts.
That would be a lot
That
of
would be
donuts.
a lot of donuts. Could you imagine the tidbits that would be flying off the shelves if that was known? But yeah, it is amazing that 50 years has flown by, and just in terms of the Sabres, like that was just on the cusp of when they were
Yes.
getting, really good. Obviously, an expansion team in 1970, but they had a great young nucleus of players, and then they had the veteran like Tim Horton, and honestly, think about that. How sad that is that if he had hung on, and not to say that he may not have retired after that year, but a year later they're in the Stanley Cup final against Philadelphia. But he was a big part of that early success in Buffalo.
Well, I think too of the luck that's kind of involved in the whole thing too, because the Sabres came into the league in 1970 with the Vancouver Canucks, and the right to pick first overall was decided by one of those carnival wheels, and the Sabres spun the wheel and they won the right to pick first, and they took Gilbert Perreault. Vancouver picked second, and they got Dale Talon. Not to say there's anything wrong with Dale Talon, but Gilbert Perreault went to Buffalo, and immediately, the Sabres 5 years later are in the Stanley Cup final. The Vancouver Canucks were kind of wallowing in mediocrity, and people in Vancouver are going to throw rocks at me for that, but it's just true.
It's just funny. I've been looking at some of the Buffalo newspapers today. It's a headline everywhere about like the darkest moment in Sabres history,
Yeah. Oh, no,
and
no doubt.
just how the impact of that incident had, and just again the personality involved of just reading a little bit how the Sabres were sort of struggling. They had made the playoffs the year before. They were struggling that season, and they were trying to get back, and they're fighting to get into the playoffs. But it is tough to think, and just the irony too of him dying, coming back from a game at Maple Leaf Gardens that night, and it is shocking. As we we're taping this, I was saying, that was Pelly Lindbergh to my generation, and growing up and hearing the news of like how did this happen? Like
Yeah.
it's unbelievable. Just like he's playing. I just saw him play the night before or what
Yeah.
have you, for the highlights, and then he's fighting for his life, and then obviously they took him off respirators. So Really one of the big hockey sports tragedies, these two men and just the connection to fast cars and untimely deaths.
Just sad. It just makes me just thinking back to that and looking at the pictures that are posting all over the place. Just it brings me back to that moment again, and just I'm in shock and I'm sad again.
Well, his legacy will always live on through the donut shops for sure, which has been just an unbelievable Canadian success story. Unfortunately, his family hasn't really felt that wealth, just the way the landscape of business is gone. But it did bring some funny stories, though, in the early part of those Leaf years, and just how one shop, and then he began to franchise it, and now it's like, as Scott Lachlan said on the show today, feels like every mile there's a Tim Horton somewhere in Canada,
Yeah.
and obviously they've tried to expand in the States and elsewhere in the world, but yeah, we reflect back on 50 years of one of the hockey's darkest moments with the death of Tim Horton.